Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, Ciaran O'Connor. On a recent episode of the podcast, I talked with Peter Wood, a conservative scholar and anthropologist who believes, like tens of millions of Americans, that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. During our discussion, Peter also claimed the January 6th riots were incited by liberal activists working in collusion with the FBI, a theory that's been trumpeted by President Trump and commentators within the conservative media. Soon after publishing the podcast, I received a notification from YouTube informing me that they had removed the video version from their platform. The podcast, they said, violated their terms on misinformation by advancing false claims about the 2020 election. After we appealed the decision and reached out to YouTube, they decided to reinstate the video due to its context. The podcast, they determined, did not aim to promote or support the objectionable content, and thus it could remain on the platform. As I made clear in the introduction to my conversation with Peter Wood, Braver Angels does not endorse or refute specific views, and we believe deeply in the need to have these kinds of conversations. Whether it's on YouTube or at the kitchen table, we think it's essential to talk with, rather than simply about, our fellow Americans and political opponents, including those who have placed their trust in false narratives. And perhaps, with the right context, establishing these lines of communication and trust across the partisan and epistemological divide could ultimately help us build fact-based consensus and reduce the power of misinformation over time. As you might expect, the Peter Wood podcast sparked some pretty strong feedback. Some listeners commended our bravery for having the conversation. On Instagram, one commenter wrote, "I don't see how this country can be reunited so long as certain voices are silenced. It is important to recognize that people like Peter Wood see themselves as defending the democratic process, not subverting it. Demonizing those with whom we disagree is ultimately counterproductive to building a free and pluralistic nation." Others were so appalled at our decision to give Peter Wood a platform that they renounced their membership to Braver Angels. They felt his views on the 2020 election and the events of January 6th were so false, so dangerous, so beyond the pale that engaging with them publicly was akin to undermining democracy and legitimizing violence. "How about someone who denied the Holocaust?" one commenter wrote. "Would you have them on the podcast?" These are serious and difficult questions that cut to the core of our very mission. Which topics should be up for discussion? Who should get a platform? Should certain topics be off limits? Is there some kind of line we should draw with respect to certain views? Or should Braver Angels remain committed to engaging with anyone who holds any view, so long as they come to the conversation in good faith? To wrestle with these issues, I've invited two senior Braver Angels leaders onto today's podcast: David Blankenhorn, the president of Braver Angels, and Jonathan Rauch, a former Braver Angels board member and the author of The Constitution of Knowledge, a recent book that grapples with our epistemic crisis and considers how we can distinguish fact from fiction in today's media and political environment. David, I'm going to start with you. You founded Braver Angels in the spirit of a clear and defined ethos. Part of the Braver Angels way, you write, is to accept that, quote, "none of us are not worth talking to." Can you talk a little bit more about the philosophy behind our approach to conversation, particularly in the context of the Peter Wood podcast and the reaction that we've received?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Ciaran and John. Wonderful to be talking with you today. Our fundamental premise is that everyone should be free to say what they think. And so we don't have a list of disallowed beliefs. We don't disallow them on the basis of, someone, including me, thinks they're false or that they're dangerous and so forth. So we don't, you say what you think. you should be able to say it freely and without fear in our Braver Angels activities. We do have criteria, we only choose topics that are really dividing the country. So we're not interested in just sensationalism for its own sake. We tend to be forward-looking and focusing on what we should do, not what happened a year or two ago. I think if, we didn't invite Peter on to discuss those issues of what happened in 2020, but they came up. And then, of course, we expect people to abide by our rules, which basically have to do with civility toward others and the willingness to listen as well as speak. But within that framework, we don't have things that we don't allow people to say. So that's, and the reason, as you suggested, and is that ultimately we think that's going to lay the foundations for a better understanding of what is true by rebuilding trust and by the traditional liberal principle that the best antidote to false statements is to not to suppress them or deplatform them, but to allow them in the public to be contested and rebutted. So that's the reason for the policy.
John, what do you think about that last idea, which is sort of something you hear when people say sunshine is the best disinfectant?
Well, it's a complex issue, and I'm going to try not to get too deep in the weeds, but it's kind of hard not to with this issue. You got to look at the specifics of that particular interview and podcast, which are very challenging, especially for you, Ciaran. I think you found yourself in a quite unexpected situation, and that's always hard to deal with. And then we've also got to talk about the mission of Braver Angels and what that really is. But I'll sketch some background first. When social media came along, I include myself, but lots of people thought, well, this is great. It's going to be a free and open marketplace of ideas, and everyone can get heard, and the good stuff will rise to the top, and no one should regulate it. We then quickly discovered what was known for centuries by sociologists, people who study information environments, and for that matter, science itself, which is that a completely open and unstructured environment for conversation leads very quickly to breakdown. People run to their tribal corners. They insist on what they think is true. They reject people who think falsely. They form tribes and communities. They get involved in schisms, conflict, and sometimes outright war. And that's where we are as a country. And Braver Angels recognizes this. Part of its secret sauce is that the conversations in our workshops and in our debates are never unstructured. Let me just say that for emphasis, they are never unstructured. The secret sauce, I believe, of this whole enterprise is we don't drop 24 people, half red and half blue, in a room for 2 days and say, go at it and have camaraderie when you come out, because we know it won't work.
Right.
And that's the point of my book, The Constitution of Knowledge. A free marketplace of ideas is the input, but if you want the output of knowledge and truth and comedy and peace, as well as freedom, you need structure. That's the Constitution of Knowledge. That requires us to do a lot of things, to stick to facts, for example, in arguments, not just make stuff up, to subject ourselves to hostile criticism, even when it hurts, all kinds of rules like that. A lot of structure. Okay. So now where are we? We have Braver Angels. We have two formats that are inherently structured so that they may not be truth-seeking per se, but they force people to encounter the other side. And those are our debates and there are workshops. But then we have this third thing. That's a podcast. It's just a platform. We invite someone, we give them some time. And our moderator, if taken by surprise, is not in a good position to counter if what starts coming out from the interviewer is a stream of falsehoods. So the problem we run into here is we do have boundaries. We have a mission. And it's not just to provide content, and it's not just to provide platforms. It's to think about things in particular ways and elevate people who are interested in the Braver Angels way. And yeah, we're going to have to do some content moderation because I think we do have some obligation to actual truth. So if someone says, my point of view is Democrats should vote on election day on Wednesday, November 4th, we're not going to put that on a podcast, or at least we shouldn't.
David, what do you think about this idea of fact checking when it comes to structure? Because I know one thing we've sought to avoid in debates, which some have suggested we do, is require everyone going in to subscribe to a certain basic set of facts. We've studiously avoided doing that. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic?
Yeah, well, in John's book, which I just couldn't possibly recommend more to our listeners, The Constitution of Knowledge, I think, John, you call them truth adjudicating institutions or truth determining institutions. We've set up painfully over a long period of time a lot of impersonal institutions that sort out the facts in what we consider to be good ways to figure out what is true. Taking your point about what a podcast is, I want to wrestle with that a minute, but in general, Braver Angels has not set itself up as such an institution. We are not set up to sort facts and determine in some authoritative way what the true facts are. Yeah, maybe that's a weakness, but it's not been our mission, and we've really stayed away from it. We challenge each other in the discussions. If somebody in a debate says, as we all know, in our Civil War of the 20th century, somebody's going to say, the next speaker is going to say, well, actually, the Civil War was in the 19th century. And so it's not like nothing can go uncontested, but we don't set ourselves up as an arbiter, and it's not like it to show the ticket for admission. You have to be cleared on the grounds that you're not going to say untrue things, or not say a lot of untrue things. We don't set ourselves up for that. And I really do think that's the right approach. And the reason I think it is that if we did, as most organizations do today, most organizations that do the kind of work we do, call it bridge building or bridging the divides, they do set themselves up in this way. And they have decided to draw certain lines in the sand. And the most fiercely drawn line in the sand has to do with the 2020 election. That and certain statements about race. But I just don't think that it makes sense for us, partly because we're not set up to do it, and partly because we'd never agree. We'd never agree on this. We have people in Braver Angels who believe that it would be wrong to platform somebody who believes in the violent overthrow of the United States government. And they further believe that the organization Black Lives Matter either supports or is willing to tolerate the violent overthrow of the United States government. Therefore, Black Lives Matter should never receive a platform in our programs. And we do give them a platform. We do, in the sense that we have had Black Lives leaders and members involved in our program. And you can just go down the list with every one of these things. And people will, once you make a list of things that are wrong that you won't allow people to say, I think that takes us too far off mission. We're not set up to do it. What we're set up to do is to try to rebuild some kind of civic engagement, ultimately, hopefully civic trust, or at least the willingness to hear each other. Hopefully that leads to good results with respect to building respect for truth.
Well, I take the point, and I should say this is a hard question for me, and in order to make the conversation, to sharpen the conversation. For this conversation, I'm taking a sharper view than I really feel, because this is a hard question. I believe strongly, as you know, David, second to none in my advocacy for many years now, freedom of speech, but also just as strongly in the discipline of fact. There are three things you need to have if you want to make knowledge. That's not our purpose at Braver Angels. We're about making peace, not knowledge. But if you do want to make knowledge, you need three things. You need freedom of speech, and you need discipline of fact, and you need diversity of viewpoint. And we're very good on numbers 1 and 3. The question is, what about number 2? Do we care about that?
We Braver Angels are good at 1 and 3.
We at Braver Angels. Now, I know that you're someone who does believe in the discipline of fact, because in our earlier lives, I have heard you say, for example, scholars, I'll make this up, I won't put this in your mouth, but something like scholars who say that family structure has no impact on child outcomes are just wrong.
Yeah, I said that a million times.
And you didn't say, well, a lot of people think that. So at the Institute for American Values, your previous think tank, we should be talking to those people, and they should be saying that, and other people should be saying other things, and our job is done. But I grant you were in a different business then. But I guess what we run into at Braver Angels is a problem of boundaries. Do we have any obligation to objective truth, or are we just going to melt into, well, if some people believe it, we should be talking about it? The latter stance has some principle behind it, but in other parts of the social media world, it's proved to be unsustainable, because it turns out that viral misinformation spreads faster than truth and is much cheaper to launch. And once it gets in, it's very hard to get out. And that's why you see Facebook and YouTube and all these other places struggling with their conflicting roles between platform and publisher, trying to be both.
Yeah.
Well, in our role as podcasters, not in our other formats, which are self-regulated because they've got reds and blues encountering each other, but in a podcast where we're just saying, we, Braver Angels, present this person, we're now playing the same role as YouTube and other social media companies. And we're now in the same dilemma, which is deciding, do we have some obligation to objective reality, or are we just going to say whoever comes on, comes on?
One of the advantages of the podcast is that we don't put it out as a live product. So we record it, and then we can listen back to it and decide if we want to put it out. And if so, do we want to make any edits? In this case, I recorded an introduction afterward to frame the conversation without seeking to explicitly fact check Peter, but sort of lay out the contours of the discussion, debate, the controversy, and make clear why we were having the conversation. And so once I had made that introduction, I felt like we had established that context, that structure that made the conversation productive. I think one of the issues is that it's difficult to assess the impact of conversations. It's easier to understand intent and principles and harder to understand impact. I think, John, you gave the example of, if we put something out where someone made the claim that election day was on a different day, conceivably the impact of that would outweigh any sort of first principle in not challenging a view voiced in one of our forums. And so it sounds like it is a question of boundaries. It sounds, John, like you're saying there are certain perhaps extraordinary instances in which the impact of that decision would be so irresponsible that it overcomes the principles. And David, you're saying that maybe that's a slippery slope, and we're not in a position to be that kind of sense-making institution. And if we were to try to present ourselves as the arbiter of fact, we would in fact be undermining our project and essentially be trying to put verification before trust, which I've heard you say in the past does not work.
Yeah, and that is exactly my own view. And we've had this since the beginning. It's never broken out in some public way quite this way before. And although it almost did when we had that discussion, y'all will remember, right after January 6th, some people said we shouldn't, some of the people that said what they said, we shouldn't have been allowed to say it, or we shouldn't have given them the platform to say it. But we've had this discussion from the beginning. People have told me, well, this person is a Braver Angels, not just member, but is a leader, and is saying horrible things on their Facebook page. Therefore, they should be either told to change what they're doing on Facebook or no longer participate in Braver Angels. And I said, that's just not the way we look at it. And if you want to contact them as a friend and complain about their Facebook stuff, fine. But we're not in charge of governing people's Facebook stuff. And we've had people say to us, well, doesn't Braver Angels believe in free speech? Isn't that fundamental? And therefore, we have Braver Angels members who support speech codes on college campuses. Why on earth are we platforming people who don't support our American Constitution? We should not allow those people to speak at our events. And we've had people who said the same thing about Black Lives Matter. And we've had people who didn't sufficiently denounce the riots or disturbances or protests or whatever the words we're going to use for what happened last summer. Those people should not be allowed to say this horrible, factually wrong stuff. And, you know, I've just always been of the opinion that we should not go down that road. And yeah, I think I'll just stop there. Oh, so just one other thing. Today, the issue that most people want to draw the line on is the 2020 election, because they believe that this is an existential question for America. Are we going to have a democracy or not? Are we going to allow a group of people to simply destroy our democracy on the grounds that whoever has power can claim that they won the election? And I have a lot of sympathy for that point of view. I couldn't disagree more with people who wander around saying Joe Biden is not the real president. But I don't want to start making a list of things that are so bad that we should just disallow them in our conversations.
So David, a couple questions to you. Is your principle then zero boundaries, invite anyone and everyone onto the Braver Angels podcast? If we had enough resources, we'd produce 10 a day and every controversial viewpoint would be represented? If not, there is some selection principle. What is it?
Well, there are selection principles, but they don't have to do with the substantive content of the view being expressed. The criteria we use are basically twofold. One is, does it meaningfully divide the country? So you could pick a sensationalist topic that is just eccentric, only a few people believe it, or it's weird, or it's more funny than dangerous. There are a lot of things like that floating around out there. And we don't pick those to discuss. We pick things that are seriously dividing the country, that lots of people on both sides, and that it's meaningful. It's not just some frivolous opinion like, is Elvis
well, those
alive?
Are meaningful and serious, and enough people are good words. But what are the boundaries? There are a lot of people, tens of millions, who believe Hillary Clinton is running a pedophile ring and shedding the blood of children and trafficking in children. A lot of people believe, a whole lot of people believe that. Should we be going and getting those people on the podcast?
If I can't believe it. Okay, I'll take the bait.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean it as bait. I'm actually inquiring because I think this is a hard issue.
And I don't mean to sound overly dogmatic, but if it were true, as I do not think it's true now, if it were true that members of Congress, senior members of the journalistic establishment, presidents of universities, I don't know, people with real access to the microphones in American society were standing up on a fairly regular basis and saying, we support jailing Clinton or putting her on trial or accusing her of treason in the Senate, or we support outlawing the Democratic Party, or we have policy proposals for America that are meaningfully related to the fact that Hillary Clinton did whatever it is with the pizza thing. If people were saying that in meaningful numbers so that it might have an impact on the political direction of America, I would say we would debate it. Yeah. But since none of those things are true now.
Well, we've got dozens of political candidates, almost all of them Republicans, who are QAnon supporters. And we arguably have a couple members of Congress, though it depends how you define it. So I guess a point that I would make there is in concept, I'd like to be with you, but in practice, I think these lines you're attempting to draw around how important is the question, how much is it dividing us, how many important people believe it, are not going to be any easier to defend and define than a line about, has the point of view stated been vetted by people who really, really look at these things hard and who are considered pretty authoritative and neutral, and have they been rejected? These are all categories that are going to involve content decisions. So I'm not sure you're falling back on ground that is firm enough to be reliable. So let me just make some suggestions about maybe how to think about this. One suggestion is, why are we doing podcasts? Maybe we shouldn't be in the content business. I don't advocate that view, but it's a different business than the rest of our business. And it presents a set of unique difficulties and trouble that we're now, maybe we want to encounter those problems.
Right.
But the rest of our business model is all about people directly confronting each other with different points of view. So it's self-regulating as long as we can keep it civil. And it works. This thing is different. The podcast situation, we might wind up just being another provider of content that is fueling the fires of these debates and arguments if we're not careful. But if we are going to do podcasts, maybe we could draw a line that says our subjects, our topics, and what we would like our guests to stick to, and what we will stick to when we edit and decide what we actually put up. We do have the right to refuse to publish a podcast if we're unsatisfied with it. We don't want debates about facts. We want to talk about policies and we talk about values, but we're not in a position to put Ciaran in the hot seat to try to provide context for all this stuff. And even if he goes and does the research afterwards and, says at the front something like, listeners should know that statement X or Y has been looked at by multiple fact checkers, and here's what they found. Maybe one of our stipulations should be we're not going to be yet another outlet that's debating facts, debating news. We're interested in values. Maybe that's a line that would be more defensible. So those are two ways to think about it.
That was the intention with the interview with Peter, but or I don't know. What do you say, Ciaran?
Well, I was just going to say that I think so much of the country, there's an animating principle behind their values and policies, which is that the 2020 election was stolen. And so conversations about values and policy veer very quickly into the fact business. And so having a value and policy-based conversation with a Republican voter about the most divisive issues in the United States is necessarily going to touch upon that epistemological question. And I think that's going to continue to increase. And so I'm not sure that we can necessarily draw that line either for podcasts or for that matter in debates. And so, but I am sympathetic John, to what you said about the Pizzagate controversy, because I think there are beliefs that are arguably just as absurd that have been elevated to the mainstream, particularly on the right. I mean, I would say that the whole birther controversy, the notion that Barack Obama was a Muslim and born in Kenya, strikes me as just as patently false and absurd, even though it sort of, I guess, plays more easily into people's pre-existing fears. But something like that is what propelled Donald Trump into office and into power in the first place, was that he was kind of the leader of those birther movements. So again, what I'm sensing is that there's this question of impact and responsibility, right? If the impact of platforming someone is ultimately the degradation of norms and democratic ideals, does that then not undermine the very principle that you're seeking to uphold by platforming them? And that's a very difficult question that I don't think we have an answer to. And I'd be curious, John, given your familiarity with certain political science literature, have there been any studies that actually look into kind of what the impact of these sorts of open conversations when it comes to driving fact-based consensus? I mean, I'm not sure exactly where that leaves us going forward, but my overall point is that I don't think we can necessarily just draw a line and say, you know, we debate value and policy and not facts, because I think those things are sort of inextricably intertwined.
Well, of course, no serious person would say you can't have conversations about facts on a Braver Angels podcast or debate or workshop. That would just be silly. It's more a question about what we think our mission is, and do we do some editing and some content choices? And what are we looking for? What are we encouraging? What are we discouraging when we tell people, you know, you're about to be on a Braver Angels podcast and we have some structures here, we have some expectations. So we're going to talk, for example, our subject will be, should we do more to secure elections? We don't want this to be a conversation about particular facts in 2020. And you can tell that to people, and sometimes it'll go wrong.
Exactly the strategy we've taken in these discussions. We have we've never wanted to relitigate 2020. We've always looked at what are our goals with respect to making our elections trustworthy. Yeah,
and that's good. I noticed that one of the things that Braver Angels did was, when this came up, it was careful. It made exactly that choice, and I thought that was smart. So that's consistent. That's a way to handle it, that it won't be foolproof. Of course, you know, there'll be occasions when someone on the left or someone on the right, or maybe some anti-vaxxer gets on there and manages to hijack 7 minutes of the podcast to say that vaccines are concocted with microchips by Bill Gates. So things will go wrong if we take that approach, but we probably then should start with a pretty clear statement of expectations and values, and we should probably make that clear to our guests. And then there should be a post-editing process where someone like, you know, Ciaran shows someone like David.
Make that clear. What is that again? Sorry. What is make that clear?
That would be that we're not here to have to litigate disputes on factual issues, that we are here to talk about disagreements of values and policies. And we understand that you can't arbitrarily limit the conversation, but that's what we expect. And then maybe post-production conversations too. In my business, I'm in old media, I'm a magazine journalist, but the same is true for TV. Sometimes producers do a segment, or editors commission an article, and then it comes in and they look at it and they say, you know what, this is just not working for us. Yeah. And it says to the person, thank you, we really appreciate it. We will pay you if there's payment involved, but this is not right for us. You need to take this message somewhere else. So maybe we could do that. We would be accused by whoever it is on the left or right in some cases of favoring one particular viewpoint. But I think if we're in the podcast business, if we're in the content business, those are conversations that we need to be having.
I like the idea of, you know, trying to look forward and to avoid recrimination and litigating the past. But I think that's sort of central to Donald Trump's political mission, is grievance, litigation, recrimination, making the 2020 claim a litmus test for Republicans that he's going to support in 2022. if Trump ends up becoming the nominee for president in 2024, I don't know that we're going to be able to avoid the issue. And so I guess a question, John, to flip it onto you. Well, what if Trump wanted to come onto the podcast? Would he qualify based on those?
No. Oh, no.
Conditions?
Well, it depends. So are we in the news business? Are we presenting people with information of civic importance? Then, of course, he belongs on the podcast. But I guess what I'm suggesting is that we're a particular organization with a particular mission in life, and that mission is about promoting civic peace and using certain particular tools to do it. David, you can feel free to disagree at any point if what I'm saying is wrong. Our mission is not to provide content. It is not to air public disputes and arguments. It is not to put all the facts before the American people, to investigate news, to make sure they're informed. We're pursuing a specific vision. And I guess another way to say what I'm saying is when we decide if we're going to have a content stream, and it's not clear to me that we should, because I think that might in some ways rub against our fundamental mission, but if we're going to be a content producer, the first question we should ask before inviting anyone on our platform is this a better angelsy thing to do? So just having Donald Trump, of course, it's not a better angelsy thing to do. Donald Trump has a million other outlets, and the same, by the way, would be true of Hillary Clinton or you name it. To me, the paradigm of the braver angelsy thing to do, one of the most, I thought, moving and superb presentations I've ever heard was a stage conversation between, I'm going to forget the names, but one was Hawk Newsome of Black Lives Matter, and the other was someone who was very conservative and an advocate of Second Amendment rights. I don't remember his name. And they agreed about nothing. But that was a braver angelsy conversation because it modeled a way of thinking and talking and engaging. And so I guess I would say before we put up a podcast or invite someone, the first thing we ask is, does this model the vision that we are trying to promote? And if it doesn't, we say, well, lots of other people could do that. Now, that's also a fuzzy line. But a guy who spent a lot of time and had a stellar career advising government and private sector corporations how to stay on track told me something always stuck with me. An organization is healthy when its priorities are first the mission, second the institution, and third the individual. So if the CEO is putting herself ahead of the institution, it fails. If the institution is putting its own well-being ahead of the mission, it fails. So that means it all starts with understanding your mission and aligning everything to that.
I find what you said very powerful just now, including the part about, I think you said the first question is it brave or angelsy? Does it model our approach, our spirit, our way of thinking about things and approaching things? Does this model that? I really like that a lot, and I think you're saying maybe we missed it with this podcast. Are you saying that?
Well, I do think we missed it. I should, since assuming that Professor Wood is going to watch this, I should say to him, in the same spirit of what I just said, I shouldn't be on the podcast either to talk about the facts of the the Capitol Hill uprising and whether the FBI was there or not, or any of that stuff. I write books and articles. I have plenty of places to talk about that. I should be on the Braver Angels podcast when it specifically serves the Braver Angels mission. So that's what I'm saying, it's not always going to be easy, but that's got to be the starting point for these conversations and these content decisions.
I don't think that our work will succeed in the future if we try to stay away from this 2020 election divide, because I do think that Trump in particular is not going to let go of it, and it has become such a part of Republican identity that it's kind of superseded a lot of the previous disagreements over values and policies. And so maybe we even need a separate team that's just thinking specifically about this one issue, because it's become so dominant and so central. And there's going to be another election in 2022, and I'm sort of anticipating regular epistemological divide over who wins. And that, to me, sort of seems like the issue of the divide is the very integrity of the vote. And so I do think that we need to think about how we can strike at the heart of that in the Braver Angels way, which is, I don't think we've figured out yet.
That's interesting to have a specific thing on that. I mean, one of the things I have been wondering about is, John, you were saying the other day that I think 70% of Republicans say that they believe Trump won the election, and 70% of Republicans say that would not be a good idea to try to overturn the election. Did I get those numbers right?
In the ballpark, as I recall. I
Yeah.
haven't really done the research to make sure about the second half, but somebody said it in an article.
What that tells me, and I can think of other reasons to think this might be true, is that a lot of people, and I think we could pick examples on the left too. I'm not trying to isolate conservatives and say there's something special about conservatives, but in this case, I think a lot of people are not rendering their opinion about some kind of forensic, scientific, finely grained factual analysis about voting machines or something else. I think what they're when they say, yeah, Trump won, but no, let's don't overturn the election. I think what they're saying is, I'm not going to say bad things about my group. I'm just not. And if somebody makes me say what I think, I'm going to say I'm in favor of my side. I think that's what they're saying, which I don't know how that would affect how we approach it in the future, and I'm not even that sure it's true. But I'm a Christian. I come from that tradition, and sometimes I think with religious faith too, does every single Christian believe in every single doctrine in a completely literal sense? Maybe not, but they're going to say, this is my group, this is my identity, this is what I'm generally in favor of, and therefore I'm on that side.
Well, this goes back to a point that Ciaran raised earlier that I didn't really address, which is Ciaran raised the question of, so really, what good does it do anyway to make choices about platforming specific facts in specific places, given that anyone can go online and get all this stuff? And does fact checking really matter? So there's a literature now that's several years old on fact checking and fact correcting, and what does it do and what does it not do? And the results won't surprise you. It is possible to change people's minds about specific facts. No, I was not at the supermarket yesterday. I was at the softball game. If there's no strong tribal or political or identity valence, that is certainly doable. But when the fact becomes embedded in a story or in a community, it is a different ballgame. And people very generally will maintain the story rather than change the facts that they believe, even if what they believe is false. Or they will acknowledge that what they thought was a fact was wrong, but they still won't change the story that they believe, because the story is about their identity. And this is true of all humans. This is not a left-wing thing or a right-wing thing. And that the inside of Braver Angels, the Braver Angels-y thing about Braver Angels, I think it's two things. One is the structure, which I mentioned earlier, which should lead us to think, okay, is there a way we can structure these conversations around fact?
Yeah.
Instead of an all or nothing approach.
Yeah.
But the second thing that's Braver Angels-y about is it embodies the other thing researchers find, which is that what Dale Carnegie once said is true, which is you can't make people agree with you, but you can make people want to agree with you. So if you start creating connections and ask curiosity questions, instead of just approaching someone and hammering them and saying, you're wrong and here are my sources, you can start to make some headway to opening up the environment. so I guess the question that we're wrestling with, and I like Ciaran's idea of maybe setting up a group or a little internal
I like the idea
group
too.
to think about this is, are there ways we can bring a Braver Angels approach to the world we now live in, which isn't the world that we even lived in when Braver Angels was founded in 2016, where we have divergent realities and there's no avoiding going hammer and tong over facts? Can we figure out ways to do that that are more constructive than what's usually done?
If you exclude, just to put it a little, I guess maybe provocatively, if you exclude all the really angry people who are seeing things in these kind of either or, good versus evil terms, if you exclude all of them, and what you only really want are people who are sort of dissatisfied with current levels of rancor, then I don't know how much of the country you're excluding, 30, 40%, half, I don't know. I mean, and so one of the things we've said at the beginning, when we first recruited our first workshop in South Lebanon, Ohio, I just remember this so vividly. I said, David Lapp, how's it going with the recruitment? He said, well, it's interesting. A lot of people are saying that they might be interested, but they're not really made right. It may not be for them because they're so angry about the election. And David said, well, actually, you're just the kind of person I'm looking for. I'm a sucker for this point of view. I really am.
Well, maybe we can distinguish the question of particular facts and particular beliefs and particular anger levels from the question of, can we figure out ways to structure these conversations that's in keeping with our mission more consistently, and that maybe engages in ways that don't deteriorate quickly into battling facts. Because another thing the literature shows is factions battling over facts, that just never works. It just does not work. It is not functional. And if what our podcasts wind up doing is people reciting their own version of facts into our microphone, then we're not doing any good in the world.
John, I will say, I know we're getting toward the close, but I do want to say back to you something that I got from your book, and it just really struck me as powerful, which is that for renewing social trust, for having the kind of vibrant truth adjudicating institutions, for having things work the way I think so many of us wish they would work, that I think you described it as twin threats, one more common on the right and one more common on the left. The more common thing on the right is saying a lot of stuff that's not true, and the more common thing on the left, or at least it's questionable, highly debatable. I'm not sure if you use the term misinformation, but saying what Peter said. And the main thing that's the threat from the left is deplatforming and canceling and trying to just exclude from the discourse people who say these bad things. And I thought that was, to me, that really felt really true. And I see it, and in myself, I just wanted to put that out there as a kind of doesn't really solve this problem that we're talking about today, but to me, those are the conflicting temptations.
I agree.
I agree too. I think that might be a good place to end on. I think we've surfaced a lot of interesting ideas that could lead to some concrete next steps that inform how we think about and shape these conversations going forward. Because as I said, I don't think these debates and divergent opinions of reality are going anywhere, and we're going to need to be better prepared next time. So I invite any of our listeners to write in with their own ideas, their thoughts on this conversation, their thoughts on the Peter Wood conversation, their thoughts on what should the role of the Braver Angels podcast be in the context of our larger work and the context of the greater political landscape. We are figuring this out as we go, as are so many of us as we approach these conversations. So we want to keep those lines of communication open. So please like, subscribe, send us feedback at media@braverangels.org, and we will see you next time.